And just to welcome all of you again, as this is part of our political action rooted in discernment series in the context of the our federal election, and it really started with in the context of the Ontario provincial election, but more focused on the federal election that we are in the midst of in Canada. And I'll have a more formal introduction in a moment, but just, tonight, this afternoon, really, we're joined by Dean Dettloff of Development and Peace, reflecting on politics and cynicism, how to nurture hope in political conversations. But before we kind of move in that theme, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and so I hand it over to Genevieve.
Thank you. Hello, friends. Boozoo. My name is Genevieve Gallant, and I'm with ORCE, the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology. And today I'm joining you from the Rita watershed on unceded Algonquin territory, the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And in particular, we recognize the long history of First Nations and Métis and Inuit people in Ontario, supporting them as distinct peoples and nations with rights to land and self-determination. So you are invited today to take a few moments to feel your feet on the floor and to focus your attention on the here and the now, and to take a moment to ask yourself or to feel what the land is asking of you. We'll take a moment to do that now. Miigwech, you're also invited, if you'd like to share your own location, the territory you're joining us from, you can also make a note of that in the chat box. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Genevieve. So just give everyone a moment just to offer their own acknowledgement of the land upon which they call home. Maybe just as we're doing that, just to say that this is not just a Jesuit forum event, that this has been in planning behind the scenes with many organizations that we work with, Development and Peace, Dean Dettloff represents, Cedric Oblad, ORCE, Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology, which Genevieve represents, Citizens for Public Justice, Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Toronto, the Ministry for Social Justice, Peace and Creation Care, with the Sisters of St. Joseph of Toronto, the Mary Ward Centre, a work of the Loretto Sisters, and Catholic Conscience, so among many. So we're grateful for everyone's collaboration with us, and some of whom are here tonight with us. And just to say that our afternoon time is kind of going to be in two parts. First, a presentation portion, which is being recorded, kind of breaking open the theme of our time together, politics and cynicism. And then we'll be breaking up into small groups, which will be, over half of our time together, and reflecting upon the theme of our evening in light of Dean's sharing with us. And then we'll come back briefly for a plenary session before we conclude. So we're very grateful to have Dean with us. I'm sure many of you have heard him before. And just as I'm speaking, I'm getting background noise, so sorry. I'm sure you can't hear it. But just a kind of a brief introduction to Dean. Dean works with Development and Peace, currently serving as Research and Advocacy Officer. And in this role, he focuses on better understanding the systematic injustices taking place in our world and how to address them in ways in light of Catholic social teachings, Catholic solidarity movement, connecting people in Canada with the peoples of the global South. And Dean might want to say more about that. And a few years ago, he completed his PhD with the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto and the Vrije University in Amsterdam. I'm pronouncing that wrong. And he researched Christianity's role in the history of colonization and liberation. And he teaches currently on Christian subjects related to Christian anti-capitalism, Christianity, Marxism, so social justice and its relationship with the church. He's also a writer among publications, America Magazine, which is a Jesuit magazine, which is part of the Canada-US Jesuit Conference, Sojourners Magazine, Commonweal Magazine, among many others, Broadview. So as we go on, I'll put links to some of those so you can find out more about Dean, but don't let that distract you from listening to him. So maybe look at that afterwards. Dean, thank you for coming to us and sharing your wisdom and your reflections on politics and cynicism, how to nurture hope in political conversations, and in particular in the context of a very consequential federal election within Canada. We are deeply involved in the political process as it happens, and it's can be very divisive. So thank you, Dean, for being with us.
Thanks, Trevor, and thanks everybody for organizing this. I'll start a presentation in a second so that you'll have something more to look at. But before, I thought maybe I would just say a bit about kind of the context out of which the work on cynicism came. When Stan asked if I would talk about cynicism, I had to think about it for a minute because it's been almost exactly a decade since I wrote my master's thesis on cynicism. And it was a very different time in the world at that time. Barack Obama was the president when I moved from the US to Canada. And at that time, Harper was prime minister, but very quickly after Trudeau was elected. So electorally speaking, you could say that there was a sort of energy of optimism, for better and for worse, in the air. And I've just found myself feeling a bit cynical about all that and felt in my graduate work that I really needed to figure that out, that I didn't want to be a cynical person, but it felt sort of unavoidable. You know, I kind of just found myself thinking things like these politicians, they're all saying these, wonderful platitudes, and yet at the same time, they're, I don't know, bombing the Middle East or not addressing the housing crisis or all these other kinds of things. And, some of that is maybe the impatience of being in your 20s and also being from the United States, where I think we grow up a little more cynically than I've learned my Canadian friends seem to grow up, also for better and for worse. But anyway, I had a chance to work that out in the context of this master's thesis. And so when Stan had asked me, I thought maybe it is time to revisit some of those thoughts on cynicism, especially as we're in this electoral moment. And when I think cynicism feels like it's actually at an all-time high, at least in North America, that it's a really uncertain time. And as we'll see in a minute, when I say cynicism, I mean both the cynicism on the part of electoral leaders and other leaders in our society. So people who seem to kind of act in self-interested ways or duplicitous ways, dishonest ways. So there's that kind of cynicism from above. And then also, though, there's a kind of cynicism from below that we find ourselves a bit cynical, unwilling to believe in a possible alternative, a bit suspicious of different stories that we're being told, again, for better and for worse. So I'm going to talk about cynicism in those two angles. And I'm going to share my screen here so that you can look at something other than my tiny square for the rest of this time. And I chose the image of these kinds of flames because you might have seen I should have just included it, but there's a meme that kind of goes around and there's a dog holding a cup of coffee. I'm sure you've all seen it. And he's surrounded by fire. And there's a little speech bubble that says, "This is fine," right? That's the kind of meme. And I think it's gone viral because it seems to kind of speak to something in our zeitgeist, in our cultural moment, that we're all surrounded by flames and we're supposed to kind of enjoy our coffee and say this is fine, knowing in fact that it is not. And we're in again, like I said, a cynical moment. And I think the challenge that we're faced with, not only in an electoral period, but before and after an election, we're faced with that challenge of how to create hope when everything feels really bad. And that's something that I do in my professional work. It is literally my job, I think, to do that in some respects at Development and Peace. But it's also something that I struggle with in a personal way. Everything does feel very bad. And my particular email inbox professionally is full of bad news. Every morning I wake up and I see a string of bad news because we work with partners who are in really challenging situations in the global south. And it's a spiritual discipline to be able to absorb that bad news and think, what am I going to do with this material with the rest of my day? And then also to stop working and do all the other things you have to do to be a normal, healthy, functioning person in the world. So hopefully this will give us some tools. I'm going to talk a little bit about philosophy and so on in a moment, and I'm going to try to make it not too complex, but I thought I would just share a couple of headlines that maybe speak to this cynicism. And they're not partisan one way or the other. They're just kind of headlines that I've discovered that might, cause one to be cynical. And I'll start kind of on the left. This is from the Washington Post. It was from 2017. And the headline was Trudeau and allies pledged 1,813 times to reform Canada's elections, and now it won't happen. So people might recall that was a big sort of broken promise, as it was reported, at least on the part of the Liberal government. Or in my other home country, having two home countries nowadays, Biden makes contradictory comments on Gaza red line in MSNBC interview just about a year ago now. And you might recall Biden had said there would be a red line if Netanyahu had entered Rafah, and he did enter Rafah, and then nothing happened, right? So there was this kind of cynicism again around that event. And lastly, one of the big ones, the UN's verdict on climate progress over the past year, there was none from the New York Times. And I think we're bombarded by these headlines all the time. And when you kind of put them all together, you could come away with a very reasonable cynicism. And that's something that I want to suggest today as well, that cynicism is a perfectly reasonable response to the times. And that's also why we have to think very hard about how not to be kind of caught in the mire of all that. So a bit of an outline here. I want to talk about what cynicism actually is. I want to talk about a few spiritual tools to address that cynicism. And then lastly, I want to talk about politics a little bit. What is our kind of political response to cynicism? And we'll start with the basics. What is cynicism? So you might think that it is as simple as skepticism. Somebody says something to you and you're skeptical of that, or you think that probably isn't the whole truth. That is a part of cynicism, I want to say, but it's not the totality of cynicism. You might also say cynicism is something like a pessimism. You see something in the news and you think of a worst case scenario, or even on the part of ruling elites, a business is just sort of planning for the inevitability of climate collapse and they're trying to make a buck out of it. That's a very pessimistic way of thinking about how to be a business person, but people do that all the time. That also, I would say, is part of cynicism, but maybe not its entirety. And lastly, something that cynics like to say, and I too like to say, is that I'm not being cynical, I'm not being pessimistic, I'm not being skeptical, I'm just being realistic, I'm being a realist. The situation is bad and I'm kind of courageous enough to admit that it's bad, which I think also is a part of cynicism, but again, not the totality. And I'm going to give you a strange definition of it that we'll unpack together, which is that cynicism is an enlightened false consciousness. I did not make up this phrase. I'll tell you where it came from in a moment, but just kind of sit with maybe the awkwardness of those three terms together. That cynicism is an enlightened false consciousness. The term comes from a German philosopher named Peter Sloterdijk. He wrote this book called The Critique of Cynical Reason. He wrote it in the 1980s. And there's lots of historical things that could be said. It's a very interesting text. And when I was thinking about my own cynicism, I found it very interesting and helpful. And as I read it, I sort of kept seeing myself in what he had been describing. And so I found that he seems to kind of get at cynicism in a deeper way. So I'm going to break down the enlightened false consciousness definition in just a moment, but I want to give you a few more quotes from this book where he kind of comes at cynicism in a descriptive way. He says, cynicism is the universally widespread way in which enlightened people see to it that they are not taken for suckers. There even seems to be something healthy in this attitude, which, after all, the will to self-preservation generally supports. It is the stance of people who realize that the times of naivete are gone. He says, cynicism knows itself to be without illusions, and yet to have been dragged down by the power of things. And he says, the discontent in our culture has assumed a new quality. It appears as a universal, diffuse cynicism. So we find ourselves discontented in many different ways. That discontent can have lots of expressions, right? Protest, resistance, etc. And Sloterdijk's making this argument that our discontent sort of ends up in this universally diffuse, cynical position. So let's break down this definition a little bit more. That gives you maybe a flavor of what's going on here. False consciousness is a term that might be familiar if you've studied critical theory or kind of German philosophers. You don't have to worry about that if that means nothing to you. It's sort of a way of just referring to ideology. It names the ways that we kind of find ourselves fooled into supporting the established order of things that aren't really in our interest necessarily. So an ideology might be something like, I see a handful of advertisements on TV and I buy something that I don't need and I don't really think twice about it. I've kind of been caught up in the ideology of consumerism and it sort of takes us on. So that's what false consciousness is trying to name. It's these ways that our consciousness, our understanding of reality are false and are falsified by lots of stories that we tell. And critical theorists really wanted to think through, well, how do we get that false consciousness? If it's false, how are we convinced by it? And for a lot of critics of ideology, the way to overcome being fooled is to use your reason to see through the illusions, which makes perfect sense, right? If it's false consciousness, then you want a true consciousness. So you should use your reason to think through the kind of lie. You want the truth rather than the lie. But one question that Sloterdijk asks is, what if our critical reason is actually creating another illusion? So we're using our critical reason to say, well, I'm not going to be fooled. But in that process, we kind of build up another kind of illusion, another kind of false consciousness. And that's what he says is cynicism. It might seem like kind of a contradiction in terms. If you're enlightened, if you know the truth, then how could you have a false consciousness, right? That's kind of the oxymoron that's in the phrase. But Sloterdijk wants to say that is what cynicism is. It's precisely in the Enlightenment task that we kind of fool ourselves in another way. And I'll explain how we do that. So there are sort of, as I mentioned, two definitions of cynicism, or two, maybe not definitions, expressions of cynicism, from above and below. So when we think of people in power, the above side, as cynical, we usually think that that means they're acting in their own self-interest, or they're abusing their power, or more simply, they're saying things that everyone, including themselves, know to be false. It's that kind of reflexive selfishness or reflexive impotence, or both. And in an election period, I mean, we see this all the time, right? You'll watch a debate between candidates and a candidate will say something and you know that the candidate doesn't really believe what they're saying. But they're saying it and they're hoping that it wins over a voter or two, right? And then candidates call each other on this process. It's the kind of game that political people play. And that's a real phenomenon in our world, right? And we might even think to just recent events, right? The stock market tumbled and today it's on the rise and there are all kinds of good questions about what might be the self-interests of such economic volatility. There's a cynicism from above, kind of, this expression. And then on the other side, when we think of people in general being cynical, we usually mean that they're suspicious of narratives of power, so they rightly see through those illusions. But they're also suspicious of proposals for alternatives, or hope for something different, or expecting more than the established order is willing to give. So we could say this is kind of a reflexive negativity. So you see somebody on the news say, I'm going to change things for the better, and you say, that'll never happen. Or somebody in your neighborhood says, let's organize against, I don't know, a corporate landlord that's exploiting us, and you say, well, we're never going to win that, so I'm not going to join that struggle, right? It's a kind of cynical negativity, not expecting too much. Sloterdijk wants to say that these cynicisms, even though they're above and below, they share this fundamental assumption. Even though things are false, or they're not sufficient, or they're even evil, things just couldn't be otherwise. It is what it is. That's the cynical kind of phrase to a T, that things are just the way that they are. So they might be false, people might be lying, you know, you might actually be exploited by your landlord or whatever, but that's just the way that things are. That's what cynicism amounts to. So think back to that enlightened false consciousness. It's enlightened because the cynic is sort of willing to admit it is what it is. I know what's really going on here, but it's a false consciousness because it's not quite true that there's nothing that can be done, or that we couldn't do anything if we didn't have the kind of will or strategy, creativity, etc., to get it done. So that we kind of get ourselves bound up, whether we have power or not, in this enlightened false consciousness. I want to talk about some spiritual tools to address this cynicism, because it holds us back from actually building the world that we need. And in a weird way, it actually binds us to injustice. It stops us from changing injustice. This is a famous painting by Raphael, The School of Athens. There's all kinds of philosophers in here. Most people have seen this in a textbook or something. In the center, you can see Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing upwards toward the heavens, or the worlds of the forms, and Aristotle is pointing outwards to the worlds of matter. And intro to philosophy classes like to show this, to talk about whatever, metaphysics and hylomorphism and all these Greek philosophy terms that we like. The character that I want to focus on is the guy sitting on the stairs, who is Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes was a very bizarre Greek philosopher. He didn't write anything himself. We just have kind of stories of what he said and did. He did wild things like live in a barrel. He played a lot of pranks on other philosophers. There's a famous story where Plato had said the definition of a human is a featherless biped. And so Diogenes went to market and bought a chicken and plucked all its feathers and released it in the gymnasium and says, this is what Plato thinks is a human being. How absurd. He's a bit of a trickster. And the most famous story of Diogenes is when the Emperor Alexander is kind of wandering around, and he finds Diogenes on the beach, and he comes to him knowing that he's a sage, a philosopher. And he says, what would you, a philosopher, say to the great Alexander? And he looks up at him and says, you're standing in my sun. And that's it. That's the big advice that he gives to Alexander. And what Sloterdijk says is the genius of someone like Diogenes is that he has this kind of self-assured understanding that he belongs in the world. He doesn't really tie himself into knots in the way that Plato and Aristotle might tie themselves into knots in philosophy. And he sort of performs a criticism of the empire. So instead of making a big logical treatise against, you know, whatever, the pride of the emperor, Diogenes just lives in this alternative kind of way. And I want to argue that this is one interesting spiritual tool. And you might see on the left here, there's cynicism with a C and cynicism with a K. And in fact, Diogenes is the first cynic in history. He forms a philosophical tradition called Cynicism, or what we could say is Cynicism, in order to just make a helpful etymological distinction. They are related in a complicated way, and Sloterdijk tells that whole story, which I will spare you in this chat. But there's a lot of interesting kind of overlaps between cynicism and cynicism, how they're not exactly the same. So what is cynicism even? Sloterdijk says it is a first reply to Athenian hegemonic idealism that goes beyond theoretical repudiation. Don't worry, I'm going to break this stuff down. He's German, so he's very verbose. It does not speak against idealism, it lives against it. So the first thing about Diogenes' cynicism is that he's not sort of cynically looking at the empire and say, oh, this is all false, but what can I do? It is what it is. He just lives in an alternative way that kind of reflects the confidence that he has. Ancient cynicism, a primary and pugnacious cynicism. was a plebeian antithesis to idealism. And master cynicism, by contrast, is the master's antithesis to their own idealism as ideology and masquerade. So again, I'll break that down. What he's saying is what Diogenes is doing is it's kind of a popular resistance to the stories that people in power tell about what's going on. Power likes to tell kind of moral justifications for itself, right? Our countries are built on certain kinds of themes, principles, morals, ideals, etc. And cynicism is sort of the understanding that people in power tell those stories, but don't necessarily live by them, right? That Canada is a nation of, I don't know, whatever, nation to nation dialogue. All the while, there are all these boil water notices on First Nations reserves all over the country, right? There are these kind of disconnects. And that's the kind of master cynicism. So what Diogenes is doing is he's a kind of, he's calling the bluff of the master cynicism by living in a different way. And also on the cynicism from below side, Sloterdijk says Greek cynicism discovers the animal body in the human and its gestures as arguments. It develops a pantomimic materialism. And he observes that kynikos in Greek literally means dog-like, that Diogenes is the dog-like person. And there's this sense that Diogenes kind of, instead of getting lost in our heads, the way that sometimes Greek philosophy, like Plato and Aristotle, can make us do, Diogenes puts us back into our bodies to say, when we get in touch with our embodied existence, we discover that there's a kind of confidence that can't be taken away by cynicism. And we see this in religious traditions all the time. You know, in Buddhism, you focus on your breath, right? You kind of get in touch with the natural rhythms of your body in such a way that it allows you to release those anxieties or thoughts in your mind. We see it in Christian forms of contemplation, meditation. There's this sense that when we get back in touch with our body, and of course, this is a very Catholic way of thinking too, that we kind of appreciate what creation gives to us. There's an incarnational kind of move happening there. In short, you could say cynicism is an embodied response to cynicism's confusion of ideas. So life is always more than we kind of fool ourselves into thinking that it is. I want to turn to another spiritual set of tools. I'm going to move a little quicker because I think this will be more familiar to us, and that is the saints. There's another great philosopher, a Jewish philosopher, Edith Wishagrad, who wrote this great book called Saints and Postmodernism. And she says that the tradition of saints also offers this embodied response to cynicism, but it's attuned to the other person, to creation, to that which is external to the self. So if Diogenes is really attuned to his own embodied confidence, the saints are also embodied, but they kind of give themselves over, like Christ, to others. So against the cynicism from above, Edith Wishagrad says that in the saints, the power to bring about new moral configurations is authorized by the prior renunciation of power. So there's a kind of opposition here where cynics are exercising their power, knowing that the morals that they believe are false some way or other. For the saints, they kind of create these new morals, not by exercising power, but by renunciating that power, renouncing that power. And from below, she says, the saintly desire for the other is excessive and wild. In the traditional Christian theological language, the saint desires not only the welfare of the other, the cessation of another's suffering, but also the other's beatitude. Not only to sit at the right hand of God oneself, but to desire the elevation of the other. So that the saint is, again, kind of going out, encountering others. Cynicism, at least in my own personal experience, it's isolating, right? We kind of build like a very hard shell, a bit of a carapace against ourselves and the world. And we do that to preserve ourselves, right? We don't want to be taken advantage of. We don't want to be suckers. And what the saint does is exactly the opposite, that it's kind of creating more opportunities to reach out to others. It's a vulnerability that allows us to connect with others, which cuts against our own forms of cynicism. And just to give you an example, maybe where we saw Raphael and Diogenes, here we might consider Giotto and St. Francis. So on the left, St. Francis giving his mantle to a poor man, a famous story in the history of Francis of Assisi. But also on the right, Francis preaching to the birds that there's a true excessive nature to the saintliness of someone like St. Francis of Assisi. And it's the kind of thing that cuts against our own cynicism, right? That we kind of allow ourselves not to return to naivete, maybe, but to discover that creation really is more than the kinds of stories that we tell to help ourselves get through the challenges of a very strange kind of political time that we live in. And I want to add one more tool here, which comes from a Russian philosopher, Nicholas Berdyaev, a bit of a weird guy, but really fascinating character. And that's an emphasis on creativity. So getting in touch with our bodies and the poor and creation can help us cut through cynical reason, like we've talked about. But we can do more than only assert our bodies or put ourselves kind of underneath or at the disposal of the other. We can also act in order to create hope. And I think this is a really key addition here. So Berdyaev says, creativeness is not an adaptation to this world, to the necessities of this world. That, by the way, is what cynicism, I think, would be. Creativeness is transition beyond the limits of this world, the overcoming of its necessity. So it's kind of puncturing through that assumption that we have this closed off political reality, nothing can ever change. The kind of creative act is the thing that punctures that bubble. And if Berdyaev doesn't do it for you, I have a great quote from Pope Francis here, where he said to social movements, in a quote that really animates my own work, "This is what I like to call you, social poets. You are social poets because you have the ability and courage to create hope where there appears to be only waste and exclusion. Poetry means creativity, and you create hope. With your hands, you know how to shape the dignity of each person, of families, of society as a whole, with land, housing, work, care, and community." And I think that's a kind of important third moment in this kind of set of spiritual tools, all of which are, I think, essential to cut through cynicism, that we can actually create hope, and that we do that through also these kinds of social processes, social movements. So it's not all on us to kind of become heroic individuals, satisfied in ourselves, or just like individual saints, but that we can work with one another to really build that alternative. All right, last section here, talking about politics. And I want to make a quick point about criticism. So overcoming cynicism doesn't mean overcoming criticism or simply having more positive thinking. And I think sometimes that is a natural reaction also to cynicism. People are like, everyone's so cynical. Why can't we all just get along? Or, why can't we just think more positively? In fact, I want to say cynicism and saintliness and creativity, they help us to sharpen our criticism to make it more effective. So the point is not to pretend that there aren't lies being told or to pretend that the world is not, in fact, very messed up, but instead to allow that criticism to be an enabling kind of criticism rather than a criticism that kind of forces us to retreat into ourselves and into the sort of self-preservation that cynicism offers. In a lot of ways, you might say the problem with cynics is that they are not critical enough. So people in power are unable to fundamentally criticize the unfair rules of the games that they're playing. That's the kind of lack of criticism on the part of people in power. So they admit their limitations too early, that there's nothing I can do that's more ambitious about the climate crisis, for example, or I can't really lay down a red line against the state of Israel, right? This is insufficiently critical at the end of the day. And on the other side, a cynical public is fundamentally unable to critically understand their own participation in injustice or penetrate beneath the same rules played by the elites. So you're willing to be critical to kind of affirm that we're being taken advantage of or not being told the whole story or whatever it might be, but not critical enough to say the rules that allow that to happen could in fact be changed if we built the sort of movements we need to change them. So if we say with fidelity to ourselves, to others, and to hope, we might discover that there are significant criticisms of how things are, And it takes courage to really investigate those criticisms in a serious way, because we might find that we need to commit ourselves to addressing those injustices. And there's a bit of a courage involved also in getting rid of our cynicism, right? Because it is the thing that helps us to get through our day, that helps us to feel empowered in a bizarre kind of way, because we know better. But knowing better is a sore consolation prize for building an alternative world. And we might say the key is to make criticism useful instead of demotivating. That's kind of the antithesis to cynicism. On the topic of organizing, cynicism prevents the people in power from actually using their power to deliver the changes that we urgently need. So we talked about that already. It prevents people outside of formal power structures, like many of us on this call, I would guess, from actually using our power to pressure elites and build the alternatives we urgently need. We do have people power. We don't always exercise it or understand the amount of power that we have, but we do in fact have a lot of power. And I wanted to pull out this other quote from Pope Francis. He wrote this exhortation called Laudate Deum, which I think passed by a lot of folks, but it's a very interesting document. It's a really impatient document. Pope Francis is very frustrated with lack of movement on climate change, and he spends a lot of time criticizing the failure of multilateral processes like the COP meetings sponsored by the UN and all these other processes. And he has this great quote that, again, I think about a lot of my own work. He says, in the medium term, globalization favors spontaneous cultural interchanges, greater mutual knowledge, and processes of integration of peoples, which end up provoking a multilateralism from below, and not simply one determined by the elites of power. The demands that rise up from below throughout the world, where activists from very different countries help and support one another, can end up pressuring the sources of power. It's to be hoped that this will happen with respect to the climate crisis. For this reason, I reiterate that unless citizens control political power, national, regional, municipal, it will not be possible to control damage to the environment. And what I love about that is it cuts through that cynicism, right? And Pope Francis is really giving us a challenge to say, could we build that multilateralism from below? And I mean, that's why I work at Development and Peace, because I believe that we can do that. And we need to have the institutions available to us to create those connections. And the last bit on organizing. As Pope Francis put it, as I quoted earlier, social movements are able to create hope where it feels impossible. And social movements need people with the courage to overcome their own antipathy and their cynicism. And I want to kind of quote the Bible here. This is where I guess I tell on myself for having gone to a Protestant school where they taught me lots of Bible verses. No knock on Catholics by any stretch, but they certainly made me memorize more Bible verses than I would have otherwise. We have to be people of faith. And I love this passage in Hebrews 11:1, that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And I think that's also a very political kind of verse. Of course, it's a spiritual verse, but it's a political statement that we do not see an alternative political horizon around the corner. But being a person of faith is to have a conviction that nevertheless it could in fact be that case. Of course, people can organize around lots of pressure points in society, labor, climate, race, gender, etc. But the point, I think, is to get organized. And I think that is really the ultimate antidote to cynicism. I think because cynicism feels like a individualizing experience, it can be tempting to then think the response is to spiritualize our way out of it by finding an alternative way to be an individual, a hopeful individual, a faithful individual, whatever that might be. But I want to say this is where that kind of third piece about creativity comes into play, that we find that with others, working with others. That's the ultimate way to kind of cut through cynicism. And this is maybe my last sort of pitch. This is where I reveal that this has all been like a big sales pitch to join the movement that I work for. But that's what we're trying to do at Development and Peace. We're trying to organize and support people who are organizing all around the world through the solidarity of the Catholic Church. And it might seem kind of like bizarre to end, a discussion about cynicism and philosophy and so on by saying you should just join this strange Catholic solidarity movement. But I really do think that that is where this kind of story cashes out. That at the end of the day, when you kind of have the courage to give yourself over to a group of people who are giving up their evenings, their weekends, some of their financial resources, etc., in order to imagine what that other world looks like, and in order to support others who are doing that all across the global south. I mean, to me, that is what has been the antidote to cynicism. Having finished, this whole thesis, the one thing that ever kind of cured me of cynicism is not philosophy or reading more and so on. It has been spending time with other people who kind of help you to believe that another world is, in fact, possible because you're building it. You're seeing the kind of glimmers of it in the cracks of the society that we have. Last conclusion, cynicism is reasonable, effective for self-preservation, and it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, but that doesn't make it true. So that's my challenge to us to think about. And overcoming cynicism, I want to say, involves these kind of three things. So rediscovering our embodied existence, that's the cynicism bit. Opening ourselves to the other, that's in the life and tradition of the saints. And stepping out to create something new and hope, which means joining Development Peace, coming to our meetings on evenings and weekends, etc. And that's all. So I'll pause there and see if maybe there are any immediate Q&As, questions, anything. And yeah, thanks for letting me talk for half an hour.
Thank you so much, Dean. So yes, so if there's any questions, initial impressions before we break up into small groups.
I do
Stan,
have a
yeah, go
question.
ahead.
I don't know if I'm allowed. Yeah. You said that cynicism is isolating, and I couldn't help thinking of, as conspiracy theories. Do you see that as kind of individuals that isolate themselves, but then kind of regroup and organize as well, but then, kind of not to combat cynicism, but kind of nurture it somehow, and maybe how to fight that?
Sorry, can you just say the example? I just cut out on my end right when you said that.
Yes, conspiracy
Ah,
theories.
yeah.
Is that an example of cynicism, but in that maybe, cutting yourself from others, but then organizing and then more difficult to fight somehow?
Yeah, so something I didn't mention, but is really fascinating increasingly to me. Sloterdijk's own motivation for doing this as a German person was to try to understand what gave rise to fascism in Germany. And he thinks it was cynicism. And he thinks that Nazism is a kind of grand conspiracy that's born out of that cynicism in kind of two ways. One is that, it strangely tries to cut through cynicism in a certain sense. It tries to give you a big story that you can believe in, right? But at the same time, it's sort of Nazism, Nazi fascism was kind of a moral story built on nothing. It was incredibly cynical. Like it's obviously cynical to be anti-Semitic and murder millions and millions of people. Like that is a cynical act in itself. But even the national building story of fascism was cynical. I mean, it was a cynical system top to bottom. And I think that it's a real cautionary tale for our own moment in history. And I think conspiracy theories are one piece of that, right? There's a bit of a story that we tell to try to say that we know better when in fact we're just doing a bit more of our false consciousness building. John, I see your hand.
Well, you're muted, John.
Now, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Dean, for your presentation. Just a point at the end where you said it's important to get organized. I think it's just as important to keep organized because there have been many, many social movements in the past that basically fulfill the criteria you spoke about, organization, hope, and everything. And eventually they run into brick walls and they peter out. And I think it's important to have stories of success. Stories are very important. And I think that maybe that's something that can be shared here in the small group discussion, stories of success that will really motivate people to show that change actually is possible because it has happened.
Thanks, John. I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Peter.
I remember one of my graduate school friends, who was an old activist from the 60s, said that the only ones from the 60s who survived as activists were the ones who had faith. So who survived multiple defeats and discouragement and cynicism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Peter. I mean, that seems to be reflected in our own movements today. I can say maybe this is a funny story, but in development and peace, and I see several of our members on the call tonight. I was an animator before I was the research and advocacy officer, so I spent a lot of time organizing. And we are an aging movement, like many social movements. And sometimes it's easy for members to be a bit understandably down on that or nervous about that, rightly so. But as a young person, I can say it is an extreme gift to be able to see people who are decades ahead of me in their life's journey, who are continuing to kind of, stay the course, and their hand is still at the plow and so on and so forth. So I think that's a great point, Peter, and it's a unique trait that people of faith have, to be able to keep committing themselves to showing up over and over again, even when it's not easy.
I have a kind of a question, but I'm going to think out loud through it a bit. No one wants to remain in cynicism, and there's a lot of energy around trying to get out of cynicism, as you put it, a resistance against power narratives. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, because I see the rise of populism as a way to escape from cynicism, in the sense of living in an alternative way, like living in a whole political, having alternative political solutions, I guess you can say, that populism offers so many people. And going populism from the bottom down, from the bottom up, and kind of moving around the political narratives, the political ways of thinking over decades. And it does embody, it does give witness also to an embodied experience. I don't want to name political names, but so many people, they, like, their intuition tells them this, the rise of conspiracy theories and so on, that they're not rationalized, but it's embodied in the sense that, yes, that the power structures are against us, or elections are rigged, but with no evidence. But it's intuitive, like it's happening. But I can't give you, I wouldn't be able to defend it in a court of law. And I think that speaks to that embodied experience. So there's these ways of trying to get out of cynicism can take dark turns as well. And I wonder, well, there's really no question there, but it's just maybe what you think of that. Like, what is the role of populism in trying to find its way out of generations of political cynicism, and people shifting their political alliances? Those who would vote for one party are now voting for a different other party because they're cynical. But it's it's rooted in these kind of conspiracy theories and so on.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. And I think that we ignore that universal and diffuse sense of cynicism to our peril, that it's something that has to be addressed. And I think we in large part, our society kind of lacks the institutions necessary to absorb that cynicism in a healthy way, whether that's through church or other kinds of associations, community associations. A lot of those things have collapsed in our societies for one reason or another. And so populism becomes that kind of mysterious binding force, that offers you a promise of salvation. I'll just say anecdotally, I was talking to a loved one in the US after the first election of Donald Trump, and I was curious about why this person voted for Donald Trump because it seemed unexpected to me. And this person, gave some reasons, and the primary one was the establishment is just bad. Like, we know that it's bad and it just needs to be sort of shaken up some way or other. And I asked if it had been a vote between someone like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, would you have thought twice about the choice that you had made? And he said, yeah, I would have had to really think about what kind of shaking up would it be. And I think that's bad political logic, personally. It's not a good way to make your choice, but I can understand where he's coming from in the sense that there is a sort of understanding that the establishment is, speaking out of one side of its mouth and not the other, and it's not working. And I think that that's a huge danger for those of us who are concerned about democracy and participation and so on. So, I think that you're exactly right. And one other person who I think is very valuable on this, unsurprisingly, is Pope Francis, who talks about a popular politics, which is different than a populist politics, but is a kind of bottom-up politics based in that fraternal encounter with one another. And I think that's the kind of burden that we have as people of faith, is to figure out how do we build those opportunities for a more popular kind of politics.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Unless there's nobody with a burning question or observation. we'll
Someone
go-
just asked in the chat that we put again the last slide of Dean in the I don't know if you can share just a slide, or maybe just show them the last slide, Dean, again.
I've just put it, I'm trying to upload it to the chat, so you should be able to see
perfect.
it there and you can hold on to it. And I think I saw Tara had a question or comment.
Oh, I just wanted to raise that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks for reminding us of that. Yeah. That's from a few minutes ago, someone requested that. So we'll move into small groups now, and we have, so it's on the hour, so we have one more hour left. And there's 3 sets of questions that our facilitators, I won't read them out now, but our facilitators of the small groups will read them out, and even put in the chat as well if you have access to the text, cut and paste in the chat. And we'll have about 15 minutes for each question, so we can come back to the plenary about 15 minutes before our conclusion, which would be in Toronto time, 6:45. Stan is putting the questions in now in the chat. So it's just a word about sharing circles. Many of you know the process, but imagine we're physically in a room together and we're sitting in a circle and we're sharing with one another on questions. And it's structured conversation. So it's not so much a back and forth. Well, it's not a back and forth at all, but we're speaking in a circle, particularly in the first round. So we're listening to one another and we're going around in a circle. So there's an established order, and we're just listening to that person for the speaker for about 2 or 3 minutes, and the facilitator will be watching the time. And if you could speak reflectively on the question and focusing on the question. Yeah, so and we're listening to the speaker, and we're not responding in any direct way. If there's time for more of a second round, that's the opportunity. But it's more of it's a listening circle. That's the emphasis, listening. And it's confidential too. When we come back into the plenary, we'll have an opportunity to share on what emerged in what we heard in our small groups, or any further questions for Dean. So I think we're ready to move into circles. Stan, who's going to organize us?
Yes, I'm sending you in breakout rooms now.
Back, everyone. So this is our plenary session, and so Tara is from Central Oblat is going to lead us in our plenary session. So Tara.
Thanks, Trevor. Yeah, so as Trevor said, I work at the Central Oblat. It's the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Ministries of the Oblates in Canada. I'm taking over from Joe Gunn, who many of you know. And yeah, I just wanted to open the floor to what resonated with you. Were there themes that emerged in your discussions? Maybe you have some more questions from Dean that came out of your discussions. So just want to open the floor to those comments or questions. If you feel more comfortable, you're also welcome to put things in the chat. Go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, thank you, Dean, for that really thought-provoking presentation. Something that came out of our group, not like directly, but kind of indirectly for me, was thinking about a story that I shared about how cynicism can lead us, like it can kind of give permission to give up on taking action for the climate, give up on like making any difference. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, about how that idea of giving up fits in with your research and what you're thinking, and if you have any tips on how to like have a conversation with people who've given up.
Yeah, I think I mean that is the danger of cynicism, that people give up and accept things as they are, right? It kind of binds us to the system that we hate in a really complex way. And I mean, something that we see a lot in social movement theory, which I think is really interesting, is that most successful social movements are successful not because they have a huge list of victories in the policy space or something like that, or because they have like, they achieved social transformation. They're successful because they've built relationships internal in that social movement. And that's true of development and peace. Like the people who come, I mean, they come for the mission, but also they come because they've built relationships with each other and they work with each other and see each other. And I think that that is part of what it means to kind of combat cynicism, to simply extend an invitation for people to connect. You can never out-argue a cynic. That's the way that cynicism works. But you can offer cynics opportunities to join you in an alternative experience, right? Like going bowling is an antidote to cynicism. Those kinds of things, I think, it's as simple and as complicated as that. And I think you can kind of scale upward from that into a common project, right? So I think it's about breaking down that kind of armor of cynicism that, as we said, is perfectly reasonable and effective. And so you have to find other reasonable and effective things which may be kind of sideways to that.
Thanks so much, Dean. I am reminded of the recorded conversation of Paulo Freire and Miles Horton. We Make the Road by Walking, and they talk about the pockets of hope, specifically in relationship building. And so I think that's really key in any work that we're doing for change. I see Jen has a comment, be an actor, not a reactor. I like. Stan, go ahead.
Yes, and thank you for that comment, Jen, because it reminds me also of what we had in our group somehow. There were a lot of comments about how to be active. I mean, it was not necessarily the theme, but like a lot of the ideas were how to answer, not answer, how to do things. And there was that idea that the metaphor of dance, you have to kind of adapt to things. And I really love that, because in some ways we're not, called to stop and do nothing, or, be silenced by cynicism and criticism, or have the final statement and that's it. You've said the truth and nobody can react. No, that's not the point. We're called to dance and work more and more and do our best and probably dance together. And I love that idea of the project that just Dean just mentioned as well. So it all makes sense. And it was a beautiful theme in our group. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. We have another comment. Seek first the kinship and see what happens, from Gregory Boyle. Is that Homeboy Industries or something? That he, yeah. Love him. Go ahead, Genevieve.
Actually, I'll just let Nicole speak because she'll probably say the same thing. So we'll go to
Sure.
Nicole.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Nicole.
We were speaking about positiveness in our group, and I got a call this morning from a friend of mine who solved all his problems. He went out yesterday and bought a puppy, and I said, "Good for you. I'm not going to do that." I said, I watched TV on Saturday, and the millions and millions and millions of Americans on the streets, and I mean millions. And I thought, God is good. There is hope, because they are damn mad and they are doing something about it. And connection, for me, is about connections. And don't try to convert anyone.
Thanks, Nicole.
I'm embarrassed to say, after all these years, I can't find a hand to raise. It's buried in a menu somewhere. I don't know if it's different for me than you, the way anyway.
When in doubt, use your own hand.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a hand that God gave me and was created with. It's just simply to say, in our group, Stan had brought up the notion of discernment, and the role of discernment in our conversations with people, in our how we read the news, how we get, how discerning are we in kind of receiving the information that we get, in contrast to how reactionary we are, or how immediately critical and unthinking critically. And Dean had mentioned how, are we critical enough? As a way of overcoming cynicism, but and the notion of discernment is really key. And I don't know, Stan, if you wanted to kind of break that open a little bit of what you were saying.
Yes, I'm trying to remember exactly what I was saying. I think it's that idea that popped up that maybe what Dean was saying is that cynicism is to stop discerning. You want to have the final word or the final idea and be dismissive, and maybe what some were saying like not act anymore, not say, as Dean mentioned, things are as they are. There's nothing more to do or to say. And somehow discernment is a movement, and it's not a movement that will stop. It's always doing more, and so we shouldn't be stopping and in discerning how far the criticism has to go. Maybe it's not far enough. Maybe it's too far. But there's always that component of criticizing enough and ourselves to basically challenging, I guess, what's the right way, the right things to say, and it's always something we have to do and work at. It's not you don't stop, and maybe that image of the dance as well. So I don't know. It came to my mind that maybe cynicism was stopping to discern when you criticize somehow.
Dean, if you have anything to kind of the notion of discernment in,
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting line actually in the Sloterdijk book where he says, we in the West, we've kind of come up with this idea that that dialogue will solve all of our problems. And he says that's a recipe for cynicism in some respects, because when you start to try to dialogue with people, you often find either that true dialogue is not reciprocated, and that's quite disappointing, or you find that, you kind of are led nowhere. But he says it's the one useful fiction that we should never let go of, Sloterdijk says. The one kind of maybe lie that we should permit ourselves to tell to ourselves, that dialogue could in fact lead to some alternative. And I think he's right about that. And Tara mentioned Paulo Freire, who has this beautiful theory of dialogue as well as a means to liberation. And I mean, I'm just struck kind of this space to me, these efforts, the dialogue spaces here are kinds of, ways of competing with that cynical impulse, right? It's setting aside a space to discern and not to immediately judge or kind of give ourselves over to our own internal monologues, but kind of, dialogue in a small group with others, which I think is a pretty radical thing to do nowadays. And yeah, so just to affirm, I think it's these kinds of events are exactly what helps to break up that logjam of cynicism that does pacify us or kind of make us feel like there's not really a way out of the news cycle, those kinds of things.
Thanks. Unless there's other burning comments, I'll turn it over to Trevor to wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, so we're almost at the hour. So just want to, well, before we conclude, it just kind of looking ahead to our few more events related to political discernment coming up. What I'll do is I'll just say a word about them. Just a quick word. Some of you have heard this. If you've been to our past events, you would know of this, but I'll just so related next week, next Tuesday on the 15th, we have John Malloy joining us. And he wrote a few years ago a study called Politics and Faith in a Polarized World, a Challenge for Catholics. And John is a former MPP from Ontario, member of provincial parliament and cabinet minister in the Kathleen Wynne government. And he is Catholic. And he's just really exploring how our faith in the political process, how they can come together in fruitful ways rather than destructive ways. And he speaks from a Catholic perspective, but he's not limited to a Catholic perspective. But people of all faiths, how does our faith relate to our political selves? It's because so often we dissociate them. We become a political animal, and then we go to church on Sunday, and there's a disconnect. So John will help us, particularly leading us in conversation on this topic in the context of our federal election. And then on May 6th, about a little less than a month from now, we're going to be joined by Joe Gunn talking about his book that he wrote a few years ago called Journeys to Justice, Reflections on Canadian Christian Activism. And it's just a way to kind of revisit examples of how a selection of faith-rooted people have been socially engaged in exemplary ways, of how they give witness in the act of social concern and action from within their faith. So that will be it's kind of like a reading, just reflecting on his book, that study. And then on June 10th, reading forum number 4, we'll call it, because we've had 4 altogether. We're going to be joined by Nigon James Sinclair from Winnipeg, University of St. Paul's. And he's going to help us reflect upon this book that he didn't write, but it's called Structures of Indifference, an Indigenous Life and Death in a Canadian City, which is Winnipeg. And it's a reflection on a study on Indigenous life in a city focused on one person, on how they have been treated by the healthcare system. And it's based on a true story of the inherent racism that Indigenous peoples face in so many scenarios, of course, but specifically in this case in the healthcare system. And Nigon James Sinclair, being from Winnipeg, he's going to help us to kind of help us to appreciate that reality. Appreciate is not the word, but yeah. So that's just a few forums that we have upcoming. So, but in conclusion to this evening, I just want to thank you, Dean, for your research, sharing your research with us, but more than your research, your wisdom and your experience, engaged in the political process, but as well as social advocacy and the role of our faith in living in the real world. So thank you so much, Dean, for being with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
to
so
all of
much,
you.
Dean.
Mm.
And thank you for everyone for joining, and thank you to the facilitators as well, Peter
Yes.
and Tara and Monica and Genevieve. And thank you very much for joining us.
Yep. And hope
Thanks so
we hope
much.
to see you again in future forums. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good
Thank you.
night.